I am here to welcome you back from your break, and hearty thanks again to our first panelists for your papers and your work that you're doing. I'm so grateful to be with you today. My name is Sara, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Loyola in ethics. I'm also a lifelong Minneapolis resident, and if no time but now, the need for us to put into challenge the status quo seems very important. And so I'm so grateful to be moderating this section where we'll be able to hear from three of our panelists. We're going to be starting off today with Molly Greening. And before Molly begins, just again, a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions, you can please issue those to me during their presentations. At the end of the time, then, we will have an opportunity for you to be able to engage more robustly with each of the presenters. So now to our second session on putting the status quo into question. Molly Greening, she, her, hers, is an educator, activist, facilitator, and musician who is too Catholic for queers and too queer for Catholics. Drawn to the divine, residing within the body, but newly rebirthed from dependence on those who may claim to hold her truth. Too non-binary to be bisexual, yet married to a straight man. She is a dissenter of the whitest, richest suburbs of Chicago, from which she calls home. Her work blurs disciplinary boundaries, bringing theology, ethics, religious studies, queer theory, and US women of color feminisms together in search for healing and transforming the wounds of interlocking systems of oppression. Molly's paper today will explore gender, coloniality, and Catholic social teaching about globalization and solidarity. And so with that, I will turn it over to Molly.
Thanks so much for the introduction there, Sara. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. I hope, can people see this right now? Okay, good. So my paper, they'll go into full screen, is going off of the theme of this panel, putting the status quo into question. And I've called it Gender, Colonization, and the Search for a Globalization Without Marginalization. In 2007, Maria Lugones published an article titled Heterosexualism and the Colonial Modern Gender System. Lugones took up Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano in his analysis. His analysis of the power structures established in the earliest days of colonialism that still impact today. However, she added her own reading that focused on the invention of a particular concept of gender that harmed women who were colonized. Gender itself, Lugones said, is a colonial introduction used to destroy peoples, cosmologies, and communities as the building ground of the civilized West. And I should note, as a content warning, I will be talking about sexual violence, slavery, and genocide. I'll be mentioning those things. Lugones claimed that we cannot understand our current global capitalist system and the harms that come from it without an analysis of this colonial modern gender system. In order to uphold the dignity of women and people living beyond the gender binary who have experienced sexualized and racialized violence, I'd like to explore this claim in greater detail, especially due to the intersection of Christian theology, the process of colonization, and the ensuing cross-cultural encounters where sex and gender norms that varied from Christian interpretations sometimes were used to justify oppression, slavery, and genocide. Investigating Lugones's claim is all the more interesting when compared to comments Pope Francis made in 2015 about the harm that comes from the Western imposition of certain sex and gender norms on countries with long histories of colonization. Pope Francis claimed that so-called gender theory, an ambiguous term, but one that most likely refers to the body of knowledge built by feminist and queer theorists, was a form of ideological colonization being forced onto Catholics by Western funders of development projects. In an interview after his flight back to Rome, he told a story of a woman he met who was trying to build schools for low-income communities for 2 decades in the Philippines. However, she could only secure funding from one donor if she promised to include, quote, gender theory in the curriculum. Though she had been organizing for at least 20 years, Pope Francis referred to this grown woman as a clever girl for accepting the conditions of the funding while lamenting the forced situation. According to Francis, many African bishops reported similar instances during the Synod on the Pastoral Care of the Family in 2014. Pope Francis went so far as to compare this gendered ideological colonization to the propaganda of the Hitler Youth. According to him, gender theory was being enforced from above and intended to homogenize a large mass of people. By sketching an outline of globalization that rejects authoritarian regimes of knowledge, Pope Francis advocated in favor of a pluralistic polyhedron approach so that, quote, every people, every part conserves its own identity without being ideologically colonized, end quote. Here we have 2 claims that decry the colonial imposition of certain gender norms upon cultures deemed non-Western. We have shared concerns of cultural destruction and systemic domination. And we have genuine concerns about preserving multiple cultural viewpoints and practices. Though Lugones and Pope Francis share these concerns, they have opposite definitions about which gender norms are dominating and which gender norms are being dominated. Let's start with Lugones' claims about one specific view of gender, namely heterosexualism, being a colonial intervention. According to Lugones' definition, heterosexualism includes within it the assumption of the existence of only 2 biological sexes. It structures sexuality as strictly procreative and heterosexual, meaning between a closed dyad of 1 biological man and 1 biological woman. It also carries with it the patriarchal assumption that men are dominant, both within hetero relationships and within society. Pope Francis, following the Catholic tradition, would also claim that there are only 2 biological sexes that cannot be separated from gender. The unity of body and soul means that gender is binary and ontological. Sexuality is a gift from God, only properly expressed through procreative sex within the bonds of marriage. Combining Thomistic theology and a reading of Genesis 1:26 through 28, Francis affirms that men and women, though different, are created equally and reflect the image of God in their differential complementarity. Interestingly, Pope Francis characterized gender theory as something that, quote, seeks to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. However, Lugones would point out that binary heterosexualism is actually erasing very significant differences. When combined with another colonial invention, racism, this gender system actually produces many genders, since norms for colonizers were different than those who were colonized. Combined with the dehumanization of racism, Black and Indigenous women were considered female, yet not fully human. Though heterosexual patriarchy contorted all female bodies into relationships of domination, colonized women were raped, murdered, and forced into slavery, going directly against bourgeois definitions of femininity that cast women as frail, chaste, and in need of protection. Perhaps Pope Francis's concerns about new forms of slavery impacting women in particular in the Amazon basin would benefit from Lugones' intersectional lens. For while Pope Francis warns that we cannot allow globalization to become a new form of colonialism, Lugones might respond that globalization and today's throwaway culture are only continuations of certain constellations of power set up during colonization that are heavily raced and gendered. Lugones identifies heterosexualism as something that was often imposed by colonizers onto many diverse modes of living, specifically giving examples from indigenous groups in the Americas that predated this imposition. For example, 150 North American societies recognize a third gender beyond just man or woman. Gay and lesbian relationships were documented in 88 indigenous nations. Sometimes this sexual expression was connected to sacred religious practices, like in the Maya, Nahua, and Andean societies. Far from gender determining domination or subordination, Lugones notes that the Susquehanna, Huron, Iroquois, Cherokee, Pueblo, Navajo, and coastal Algonquians were gynocratic societies, a term Paula Allen Gunn used to define matriarchal democracies. Lugones also notes the multiplicity of biological sex, highlighting that between 1% and 4% of the global population are intersex, or born with chromosomes that go beyond XX and XY. Lugones gives these examples to break through what she calls, quote, the mythical presentation of these elements as metaphysically prior, something that is an important aspect of the cognitive model of Eurocentered global capitalism. I believe that Pope Francis is also trying to push back against a totalizing cognitive model that degrades both human beings and the earth. In Querida Amazonia, he claims that we can and must overcome the various colonizing mentalities in order to create, quote, networks of solidarity and development. He ends the paragraph with another quote from John Paul II. The challenge, in short, is to ensure a globalization in solidarity, a globalization without marginalization. Lugones also talks about solidarity, but her emphasis is on the ways that both liberationist men and white women break bonds of solidarity with women of color by erasing this intersection of race and gender. Indeed, it completely erases solidarity with people who exist beyond the sex and gender binary. If we take Pope John Paul II's criteria for ethical assessment of globalization, as Francis does, then we will see that this intersection of gender and race and the resulting violence is crucial to view if we are to ensure that all human beings are treated as subjects and not objects to be used or sold. But who gets to be a subject? Who gets to have religion? Deeper exploration into colonial histories would show that these questions are more complex than they may seem. If we're concerned about preserving cultural diversity and religious freedom in particular, then highlighting the ways that non-binary gender and non-heterosexual expressions were often central and even sacred to some indigenous communities puts this Catholic criteria into question. I'll close with some reflections on this discrepancy, since I think it actually gets back to the tension posed in the beginning about the conflicting claims of what constitutes an ideological colonization of gender. Though Pope Francis has engaged colonial histories more explicitly recently, I think that the positioning of Catholic social teaching in general is toward modernity, defined by the European Industrial Revolution. With this starting point, the preservation of religions can be safeguarded against a threatening secularizing modernity, without explicitly engaging the domination and violence that accompanied colonization and Christian religious conversion, and how that intersected with racial categories. Historically, the understanding of only two biological sexes linked to only two genders was intensified and rigidified within European history in the 18th century. Following the work of Melissa Pagan, what would happen if Catholic social teaching shifted the analysis of modernity from 18th century Europe to colonial encounters beginning in the 15th century? I believe that this would have serious implications for truly securing a globalization in solidarity and not marginalization, a value that both Maria Lugones and Pope Francis would agree upon, even if their analyses of gender are contradictory. Thank you.
Wonderful. Molly, thank you so much for your work and your presentation here, and for inviting us into a space to trouble the status quo as it relates to gender and sexuality. And would again invite all of you who are participating on Zoom, if you have any questions or further engagement that you would like to see us have during our Q&A and discussion time, please feel free to send me a note with your question and or comment. Thank you again, Molly. Now we will go to our second presenter for this session. I'm pleased to introduce to you Evan. Evan Marsolek, he, him, his, is a third-year PhD student in integrative study of ethics and theology at Loyola University here in Chicago. His research interests include queer theory, queer theology, psychoanalysis, sexuology, sexology, and cultural studies. Evan comes from the frosty north of Fargo, North Dakota, by way of my hometown, Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota. This geographical socialization has surrounded Evan with a particular collective of queer identities where theological imaginations run deep. And he is interested in exploring the contours of these queer believers. When not reading and writing, Evan enjoys cooking and spending quality time with his partner and dog. I'm pleased to hear from Evan today as his paper engages with homosexual and queer courses of action in response to the form from the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. And so with that, Evan, we'll send it to you.
Thank you so much. I've titled this presentation, Dreaming at the End of a World. On March 15th, 2021, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a responsum to Dubium regarding the blessings of same-sex unions. Due to the nature of responsa, the ruling was concise, negative, with a brief explanatory note. Since that day, many theologians have come forward criticizing the document. This is not surprising, as many documents issued by the Roman Catholic Church regarding human sexualities and genders often spur such response. However, today I want to set aside those particular conversations and instead turn to queer reflections on this matter as we put the status quo in question. A few introductory notes on language. I will employ the terminology queer, which I recognize is malapropos, dare I say anathema, with respect to terminology employed by the Catholic Church. The term queer, while not popular in past times, is now often employed as an umbrella term for the LGBTQIA+ community and accompanying political goals. And it is also descriptive of an entire collection of theories which often call into question those political goals. To create a distinct framing of the differing political visions I am presenting, I will defer to tactics used in queer theories, highlighting the performative force of explicit word choice by referencing political goals of the LGBTQIA+ communities and the pathologizing language of homosexual to draw attention to the limited political realities that can tend to manifest, which will be touched on later in this presentation. Of all mundane things, my Facebook newsfeed was filled with reflections and responses. Frustration from Catholic friends, offers for blessings within Protestant traditions from ordained colleagues, and the obligatory atheist retorts extolling their victory due to a self-inflicted wound to the relevancy of Catholicism in the present age. A couple of things intrigued me. First, the fact this managed to trickle into my newsfeed so quickly, and second, the persistent question of whether the blessing of same-sex unions as a goal for homosexual persons in either political or theological spheres is even a worthwhile endeavor as it presents its own form of participating within a status quo. Today, my thoughts will be guided primarily by Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism, particularly her framing of the idea, how it functions and what it reveals to assess standing before an impasse in relationship to a larger structure, what I will refer to as a queer impasse. Additionally, Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia will function as a jumping off point toward a constructive path forward. Of course, noting from this outset, it is not the only possible path, but one of endless queer potentialities. I will arrive at the claim that if queers are to attain the blessing of same-sex unions, it can only occur through a form of Christianity that is not yet here, and a Christianity that is rooted in queerness's exclusion and not through its inclusion in currently existing Christianities. Put another way, the blessing of same-sex unions cannot be sought within virtually any currently existing Christian tradition, as this homosexual relationship will maintain the same power dynamic of the heterosexual ideology with which it is often presented as antithetical. And furthermore, it ultimately divides homosexual communities as those who are acceptable homosexuals, the so-called good gays, to be brought into a certain form of Christianity, and those other homosexuals who are just too deviant to be part of any Christianity. To begin, Berlant describes cruel optimism as, quote, the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object, unquote. But what does this mean? And how does this help us to begin to parse through reactions to the responsum? Well, first, we all attach ourselves to objects with a desire they will help us toward our flourishing. This is important for Berlant, as she contends people wouldn't just attach to objects if there was not a promise and optimism attached to it, whether at a conscious or unconscious level. Furthermore, we cannot propose that the proper course of action is to simply unattach, as we are humans, and this is what humans do to provide some sense of stability to their lives. In other words, even if we unattach from one object attachment, we will create a new one. This is why Berlant contends that any object attachment can turn into cruel optimism, as no object attachment begins with this as its end goal, but all object attachments hold this possibility. When cruel optimism rears its head, Berlant describes it as, quote, encountering scenes where object loss appears to entail the loss of an entire world, and therefore a loss of confidence about how to live on, even at the micro level of bodily comportment, unquote. As the attachments we create entail a network of promises, cruel optimism brings us before an impasse, a point at which frightening or disappointing experiences occur, and also a point at which it is yet to be determined if any analysis will occur regarding said event. At such an impasse, there are branches of possibilities. Suffer without working through the collapse of a world and perpetuate the cycle of cruel optimism. Suffer and work through the collapse of a world and find new agency in one's knowledge of this problematic attachment and work to change the factors that enact this cruel optimism. Suffer and work through the collapse of a world and reject this attachment as a viable option for flourishing. These courses of action are by far not an exhaustive list, but I brought these to the fore as they highlight dominant strands of action to standing before the queer impasse. And for the present moment, I am focusing only on the latter two. Binaristic, I know, but we have a time limit to keep. To repeat, suffer and work through the collapse of a world and find new agency in one's knowledge of this problematic attachment and work to change the factors that enact this cruel optimism. And suffer and work through the collapse of a world and reject this attachment as a viable option for flourishing. In this framing, the CDF's negative holds the force of a world being shattered. Suddenly, the possibly queer, possibly homosexual person is before the impasse, where a cluster of promises have been revealed to be inaccessible to them. This ability of access weaves its way through Berlant as that factor that represents the visible truth of this cluster of promises. person X is able to have this life, therefore I too am able to have said life. This life, however, is one that is revealed to be impossible in the current construction. To be fair, at the scale at which we are working, we are talking about the Catholic Church and to an extent civil union within the political sphere. These are not necessarily small attachments that one develops, but attachments that have been shaped deep within the unconscious as a quote unquote natural life. Put another way, the institutions are just the hegemonic fantasy that now hold the weight of the symbolic, and queer bodies are unintelligible within these symbolic structures. To complicate this matter, within some countries, there has been the legalization of marriage equality. This now presents two competing symbolic structures, both of which hold political weight with peoples who are willing to show the force of that weight. It is in this vein I locate the first track of reflection, suffer and work through the work of the collapse of the world and find new agency in one's knowledge of this problematic attachment and work to change the factors that enact this cruel optimism. This can be a typical response to such matters. Structures press upon our bodies in ways that limit us, and we can respond with a political force that seeks to augment these realities. In the present example, from the perspective that more than a few of us here are part of the academy in some way, perhaps a response in this line of thinking would take the shape through a robust theological analysis of the document, pointing out its logical flaws, drawing the obligatory connections to specific thinkers who we just can't imagine as propping up a heterosexual ideology, and noting the overall gross limitations that are present within the document itself. While it is crucial people still engage in this work, we must ask ourselves if by playing the game by someone else's rules, are we really being queer? Or are we simply showing that we too, the well-read, theologically savvy, bootlicking homosexual, are just as acceptable as the heterosexuals, and therefore there is no reason that this matter should be an impasse for homosexuals? It is the resounding chorus of, we are welcome to the party too, and here's why. Now, please hear me. I am not saying that this is not a viable course of action in any way, shape, or form. I am saying and asking ultimately, is this a queer course of action? I am saying there is a false sense of salvation. As Berlant notes, quote, whatever the experience of optimism is in particular, then the affective structure of an optimistic attachment involves a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of fantasy that enables you to expect that this time, nearness to this thing will help you or a world become different in just the right way. But again, optimism is cruel when the object seen that ignites a sense of possibility actually makes it impossible to attain the expansive transformation for which a person or a people risks striving. And doubly, it is cruel insofar as the very pleasures of being inside a relation that have become sustaining regardless of the content of the relation, such that a person or a world finds itself bound to a situation or profound threat that is at the same time profoundly confirming, unquote. Notice the interplay here. Berlant starts with alluding to what I'm calling a reference to a false sense of salvation. The notion that this time, in this way, and by these means, things can become different in just the right way, without anything having fundamentally transformed. Furthermore, what also comes out is one's nearness to this problematic optimistic attachment. If we are dealing with attachments that are buried deep in the unconscious, these attachments are not quickly broken and reworked. And Berlant notes that this is what makes this optimism particularly cruel. Since the cluster of promises entails a particular expression of life, it ignites a desire that this is a reality in which one wants to, perhaps needs to, participate. But ultimately, the structure is actually created in a way where it is impossible to attain the transformation that is so desperately sought. This attachment runs so deep that a precarious existence in a system where there is no possibility of transformation has been understood as a better option than a precarious existence where the potentiality of a new way of creating a world is an open horizon. This idea of an open horizon brings me to the second response I want to spend time on. Work through the collapse of a world and reject this attachment as a viable option for flourishing. Recall from just a moment ago that proximity plays a role in Berlant's formulations of cruel optimism. I personally am more rooted within Protestant thinking, despite being raised Catholic, and my own proximity to the blessing of same-sex unions through the lens of the CDF document must be understood at some distance. Put another way, I don't have as much at stake because these attachments do not form the background of myself. But these queer reflections also align with many of the critiques of the pragmatic homosexual politics of the past few years, as the example of civil unions and marriages arise in virtually every queer theory text. For many, the seeking of marriage equality is the epitome of homonormative agenda, which aligns with a previously explored response when the homosexual is before the impasse. Coined in the early 2000s, Lisa Dugan's concept of homonormativity has gained much traction within subsequent theories. Homonormativity is the replication of heterosexual ideology within homosexual culture, in brief. Worthy of note is that homonormative politics also disproportionately privilege the white cis male monogamous person. This therefore creates two classes of homosexual people: the socially accepted homosexual, often the white gay male, and those other two deviant homosexuals who are unable to be rendered as intelligible beings within heterosexual ideology. To recall from the outset, this may not be the intention of pragmatic homosexual actions, but political achievements often tend to only encompass a very limited group within the homosexual community. This is why, in my opinion, the previously explored response is not a queer response. Yes, one could argue a form of disruption occurs, but if this disruption only leads to the particular enfranchisement of a particular sexual or gender identity, and if this enfranchisement is an act of inclusion extended by those who already possess the power to determine who gets included and who gets excluded, then it is not disruptive, but assimilative. Have we really put the status quo in question? It is clear by now my position aligns with the notion that we must reject this attachment as a viable option for flourishing. However, drawing on Jose Esteban Munoz, queerness does not necessarily offer definitive contours of this vision, rather impressions of potentialities. Munoz claims boldly from the outset of Cruising Utopia, quote, "Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as a warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house. We must strive in the face of the here and now, this totalizing rendering of reality, to think and feel a then and there. Some will say all we have are the pleasures of this moment, but we must never settle for that minimal transport. We must dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately new worlds. Queerness is a longing that propels us onward beyond romances of the negative and toiling in the present. Queerness is that thing that lets us feel that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing," unquote. Well, even to some queers, Munoz's claim can be quite the shocker. We're not yet queer? Queerness is an ideality? We may never touch it. At first glance, this could appear confusing and not very promising for queer politics, but Munoz's work is actually trying to express that if we are rooting a queer politics in the here and now, we've already missed it. Rather, queerness's politics straddle the then and there, a position that helps us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. Compare this to the prior course of action to the CDF document, a position rooted in the present quagmire, desperately trying to say that this moment, right here and now, there is queerness. But this is just something that we cannot truly ascertain. Like the title of the presentation suggests, we must dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately new worlds. This dreaming allows the queerness to be envisioned, even if we cannot touch it, cannot feel its pleasure, cannot embrace its warmth. But this dreaming, grounded in the then and there, can enable actions in the present that actively work to construct this world. This dreaming can be the course of action queers embody after they have stood before the impasse and endured the collapse of the world, after they have rejected a cruel optimism. And remember, just because one optimistic attachment has been rejected as a cruel optimism does not mean a new cruel optimism cannot take root, as a new optimistic attachment will be formed, but it is yet to be determined if it will be cruel. The dreaming of a new world that is not yet here, paired with the devices to analyze potential cruel optimisms, provides us the tools that enable us to constructively deconstruct a world. It creates a critical interplay that provides techniques to read and respond to our worlds and ceaselessly dream new worlds into existence. Munoz employs utopia to describe this potentiality for the precise reason that utopia is an ungraspable thing, but nonetheless offers a tool to which to analyze the past, present, and future. We can attune ourselves to the present and recognize the unqueerness of the moment. As we just heard him state that the quagmire of the present, how we should never settle for that minimal transport, and that this world is not enough, that indeed something is missing. We are stuck in a straight time and place, and the very act of asking for, desiring, imagining another time and place, another world, is to represent and perform a desire that is both utopian and queer. We can draw from a then and there, where the glimpse of potentiality hangs like a residue in the past, in order to disrupt the here and now, because that then and there also has the potentiality to be a future. When I reflect on this CDF document in a queer manner, I can only find hope if we claim that we are not yet Christian. We are not yet church. Christianity church is not yet here. Furthermore, we may never touch Christianity. We may never feel its warm illumination. The here and now of Christianity burdens itself with the task of assimilative political action, as if Jesus lived, died, and rose only then to say, come follow me, blue-collar fishermen, tax collectors, sex workers, and the disabled. You too are welcome into this system. Or some take the angle that we start from those in the margins, but then somehow we often arrive at the same proper systematized thought. And we must ask ourselves if in this task of systematic thought, we are only able to create systemic theological problems. We must ask, is there a then and there of Christianity that allows us to begin to articulate the contours of a queer Christianity? Are we doomed to cycles of cruel optimism and the political action that only seeks assimilation? This is why we must claim that if queers are to attain the blessing of same-sex unions, it can only occur through a form of Christianity that is not yet here, and one that is rooted in queerness's exclusion and not through its inclusion by currently existing Christianities. It's a Christianity that does not look like Christianity, an unintelligible Christianity that is from the unintelligible bodies that heterosexual ideology has rendered ungrievable, a perverted Christianity that tears away the guise of a properly ordered life and theology, a theology that doesn't look like theology. We have to think long and hard if the CDF document represents the cruel optimism that will always potentially exist in the background, despite particular dispositions toward queers or homosexuals in individual congregations. If the desire is a particular participation in a structure, homosexuals must ask, who is now being excluded in my inclusion? And again, if the matter at hand is ultimately about a form of assimilation, is it queer? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your paper and your work, Evan, and just inviting us to both continue to even trouble our asking of the questions, inviting us to dream. And it makes me think as a fellow Protestant of the Pauline, not that I have already attained queerness, you know, a little translation insertion on my own, or have already arrived at the realization of the dream, but we press on to take hold of that, which might continually disrupt us. So thank you for that. Now we'll go to our third and final presentation of this session. Very pleased to be able to hear from my colleague and our colleague, Nathan Pederson. Nathan is a PhD candidate at Loyola University Chicago in theology. Nathan's work pursues topics such as aesthetic pedagogy, language and the symbolic, and the notion of race within religion and politics. Nathan recently contributed a chapter, "The Symbol Gives Rise to Race," in the volume A Companion to Paul Ricoeur's The Symbolism of Evil. Nathan's work is often set within the milieu of phenomenology, contemporary issues, and continental philosophy of religion, and Trinitarian theology. Often he seeks particularly to explore the intersection between evangelical theology and liberative theologies. Nathan is currently working on his dissertation with a preliminary title, White Enigma, Opacity, Perspective, and the Theological Formation of White Subjectivity. Today, Nathan's presentation will be exploring whiteness and theology ethics. And so we'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Sarah. I've been experiencing little glitches here or there, so hopefully I am solid and don't cut out. The title of my paper today is Figuring the Future Amidst the Opaque White Racist Self, Tragic Critical Thought as a Mode of Ethical Being. How do we imagine an ethical future amidst a racialized world? More to my point here today, how can one be white and live ethically for tomorrow? As the problem of a racialized world is rooted in the historical and ongoing construction of whiteness, the most important work for white people, I argue, is to work on themselves as a primary expression of the work of anti-racism, from which their other efforts toward genuine structural and external change will be better secured. A difficult introspective task that challenges even well-meaning white progressives. If white people become too externally focused, they risk only perpetuating the status quo. Focusing on the notion of opacity, and then in view of that, the notion of tragedy, shows that internal deconstructive work of whites is most promising, since it focuses on the very mechanisms of constructing a racialized world in the first place. George Yancey, drawing on Judith Butler's Giving an Account of Oneself, speaks of the need to indefinitely tarry with one's whiteness and recognize one can never escape their whiteness and the privilege and power it brings. He speaks of this under the notion of the opaque white racist self. He writes, quote, "White racism is embedded within one's embodied perceptual engagement with the social world and is woven into, etched into the white psyche, forming an opaque white racist self that influences and often overshadows everyday mundane transactions," end quote. Whiteness cannot be escaped, and one cannot, in fact, rush past one's racism. One always already arrives too late in this regard and is unable to give a full account of one's racism. Again, Yancey, quote, "Rather, the reality of the sheer depth of white racialization is far too opaque," end quote. Now, thinking about whiteness and opacity is rather productive. In my own work, I have begun to explore how race develops as a symbol of evil through the pathologization of the symbol's opacity. Opacity points to the productive richness or surplus at stake in the ambiguity or indeterminacy arising from the hidden revealed dialectic of the symbol, out of which we gain understanding toward thought and language. But the notion of opacity also betrays the complex way in which symbols and selves can also go wrong and become a place where structures or actions of othering are masked. Charles Long, in particular, traces how the symbol goes wrong in the racialization of opacity itself, where opacity over against the transparency of whiteness is thinned to a first level negative discourse and moralized as a symbol of evil, whereas Blackness, opacity is associated with impurity and defilement. What Long is capitalizing on here is how the fundamental indeterminacy at the heart of symbolic opacity can take on a life of its own in a pathologization that can spin out economies of evil. And it is helpful to think of this pathologization in its various aspects, as opacity is connected heuristically to other themes like the uncanny and the fetish. Freud discusses the uncanny, Unheimlichkeit, as something terrifying yet familiar. For example, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, the experience of being afraid for a split second of your own unexpected reflection in a mirror. And this heightens the uncanny here, heightens the hidden, revealed dialectic at stake already in opacity, as I have explained. The uncanny is, quote, according to Freud, on the one hand, that which is familiar and congenial, and on the other, that which is concealed and kept out of sight, end quote. The uncanny is often that which is perceived as involuntary repetition or fateful, inescapable chance encounters or circumstances, events which for a moment harken back, according to Freud, to a time when the ego was not yet sharply differentiated from the external world and from other persons. In all of this, there is a doubling at stake here, resonating with the doubling at stake in the symbol's layers of meaning. Such doubling is fundamentally uncanny, according to Freud, because it taps into this familiar, unfamiliar dialectic of repression and to an infantile repetition compulsion principle in our unconscious mind. We perceive as uncanny those things and circumstances that remind us of this inner repetition principle. So both familiar and hidden at the same time, quote, this uncanny is in reality nothing new or foreign, but something familiar and old established in the mind that has been estranged only by the process of repression and is revived by some impression. With the uncanny, this tension of given, hidden at stake in symbolic opacity is represented pathologically in the psyche and is connected to the psychic fear of the unknown, deeply rooted in the self's erotic drive. We could go further and explore these themes of opacity and uncanny in fetishism. This would also bring us closer to the topic of racialization in light of the history of the fetish being connected to the colonial contact of European merchants with Africans and the Europeans' dismissive and repulsive stereotyping in view of certain prized, even sacred objects that Africans were reluctant to trade. In any case, one recent theorist describes fetishism as, quote, a mental strategy or defense that enables a human being to transform something or someone with its own enigmatic energy and immaterial essence into something or someone that is material and tangibly real, a form of being that makes that something or someone controllable, end quote. Here, the opaque, enigmatic unknown is doubled, so to speak, as it is substantiated into an object for the purpose of controlling the darkness or unknown one fears. So from opacity to the uncanny to the fetish, of pathologization, sexualizing, and racializing the enigmatic, unknown darkness of symbolic indeterminacy, building tangible economic worlds of domination and control for white subjectivity over its sexual and racial otherness. We can trace out, or I trace out, the following process as opacity in its intersectionality is pathologized in the formation of white subjectivity. Unable to penetrate the opaque or unknown, opacity itself is objectified as the density of the unknown. And it is then set over against a self-project now interested in appropriating such opacity, such unknownness as a drive within one's own subjectivity. This internal drive is moved by the lack of the fullness of one's self, which the opaque unknown marks by a first-order negation. Now the potency of opacity for self-formation is ignored, and opacity now stands as an obstacle for the certainty of self-saturation and self-limitlessness that a powerful particularity needs to maintain its lucidity, its purity. And as the self attempts all the more to keep hidden within itself this inoperative center of indeterminacy that is never erased but masked over, it pushes this opacity deeper into its unconscious foundation through a radical technical externalization into the other of the dark body. The dark, ultimately female body then begins to bear the weight of all the hidden desire and dissimulated meaning, the enigma lack, and confusion that self-saturation continually tries to cleanse from its own making. In the end, whiteness is a symbol that responds on the deepest moral and emotional register to its inner excess or ambiguity that it cannot master, which it can never escape from, though it continually tries to objectifies and externalize, and in fact, from which it is continually haunted. Now, while connecting whiteness to opacity has wide explanatory approaches, as I have tried to show, what I want to do here is to connect this thinking of whiteness and opacity together as also connected to the notion of tragedy. Tragedy is important for several reasons as I tried to think honestly about whiteness and how to be or live ethically as white. What I am trying to press on is tragedy's emphasis on character formation as caught in a certain vision, sight, or horizon that is limited and destructive, though unknowingly so, to the character. This focus on tragedy's theme of the already there-ness and already within-ness of evil means that whiteness is fundamentally a tragedy, always already having been forged through this kind of symbolism of evil and color that I have showed. But Paul Ricoeur explains that tragedy teaches ethics not in a didactic sense, but more resembling a conversion of the manner of looking. Tragic wisdom, Ricoeur explains, speaks toward the limited horizon or vision of ethics and gives us a way to navigate impassable situations. So that's one thing at stake in tragedy, but I'm also pressing on the affective and transformational potential of dramatizing whiteness through the inherently performative nature of classical tragedy, how in tragedy, according to Ricoeur, we await the shock, even to ethics as a whole, but certainly to our subjective formation, quote, capable of awakening our mistrust with respect not only to the illusions of the heart, but also to the illusions born of the hubris of practical reason itself, end quote. Indeed, as George Yancey discusses, this tragic dimension of white opacity puts an epistemic limit on white understanding and vision. Quote, Yancey says, there is no dry dock where white people can go to rehabilitate their whiteness. The white self is already on the open sea of white power, privilege, and narcissism. One must begin with the racist white self, and there is no innocent, fictive tabula rasa to which one can return. Indeed, the white self that desires and attempts to rebuild or rehabilitate itself does so precisely within the context of complex and formative white, racist, social, institutional, material, and intrapsychic forces, end quote. Opacity, now thought under genuine tragedy, marks an acceptance of unknowing instead of its overcoming, the overcoming of unknowing. This is, though, to distinguish from the notion of, say, white ignorance by Charles Mills, which is a pathological or apathetic unknowing. Instead, opacity here under the notion of tragedy and trying to retool it represents a kind of productive unknown, an apophatic posture that in humility seeks transformation in the face of the ungraspable. Yet, if we are to retool opacity in this way, this also speaks of the tension of finding hope within the same pathology that led to horror. Can redemption really also come from here? And so we can rightly wonder whether we should simply throw out the notion of opacity and find a different way. But thinking honestly about tragedy in these ways that I have spoken of allows me, I believe, to work towards saying something about the kind of practice or thought that accepts the pathologization of opacity and yet seeks to recharge this opacity for a more hopeful future. And I call this thought or practice tragic critical thought. So from these same depths of opacity, there is still a possibility for hope and for setting right. This is why Emily Towns, for example, speaks of the power of counter memory, retrieving for the good what has been deemed fantastic and used for evil. Tragedy is key here because we do not seek a cheap present or a cheap future that erases the past. Though masked, occluded, and diverted towards the symbolics of evil, the opacity of the symbol can still give ethical thought, drawing from its fecundity towards superabundant promise. The potential then of tragic critical thought is to go deeper into the symbol's fragility to reorganize its defilement logic. The catharsis undergone in such a project would fundamentally, I argue, be a re-examination of opacity and the fantastic for what it actually is, and working through the uncanny in a critical therapeutic way. I am reminded of Ricoeur's note on the work of remembering against the compulsion to repeat when discussing blocked memory at the pathological therapeutic level as a type of abusive memory in his book, Memory, History, and Forgetting. Drawing on Freud's essay, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, Ricoeur notes how resistances to memory are due to repression, which is, according to Freud, the compulsion to repeat. Thus, acting out is substituted for memory as the patient, in the words of Freud, quote, reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without, of course, knowing that he is repeating it. But therapy occasions a working through that is a work of remembering. Quote, here ceasing to lament or to hide his true state from himself, the patient must find the courage to direct his attention to the phenomenon of his illness. His illness itself must no longer seem to him contemptible, but must become an enemy worthy of his mettle, a piece of his personality which has solid ground for its existence, and out of which things of value for his future life have to be derived. Otherwise, there will be no reconciliation of the patient with the repressed material, end quote. Belonging to this work, argues Ricoeur, lies, quote, the courage required on the part of the analysand to recognize himself as ill in search of a truthful relation to his past, end quote. But this all is very uncomfortable, is an uncomfortable place to be, let alone kind of place to inhabit. We all want to tie up the tragic in some happy reconciliation or find clarity in the midst of the darkness of uncertainty. So drawing on all of these thoughts, I envision a future ethical tragic whiteness as a kind of critical solicitude, but one that must go deeper into the ethical problem, marking a deeper problem or rift that threatens, in fact, to render asunder all wisdom, all conversation, all deliberation, and all understanding. Ricoeur proposes, as I have explained, recovering of phronesis or wisdom that has to be at stake here as a kind of new rationality or ability to navigate the tragic situation. Thus, tragic wisdom or thought seeks a certain catharsis, as I have stated, like the removal of a cataract, clouding or opacifying the lens of our vision. White people in such tragic thought can never see clearly, that is the desire of whiteness, in fact, but can reach toward the hope of an ethical future through a kind of attestation, testimony, or conviction. But conviction here is fundamentally a recognition of the other. In fact, a recognition that, according to Ricoeur, carries self-esteem towards solicitude or being with the other, and then solicitude towards just institutions. Such recognition would be the undoing of whiteness, as it is a kind of conversion. So how, if at all, might we theologically turn around the self, the white self, not only in light of the phenomenological genesis of the modern self being bound up in this pathology, as I have explained, but even thinking about, for example, J. Cameron Carter, the fact that theology itself has aided and abetted this racialization. Personally, I'm beginning to think through David Tracy's classic as a possible place to start this process of theologically reconfiguring whiteness as a tragic symbol. According to Tracy, we are thrown into the classic and its uncanniness, in fact, like I've explained, as uncanniness is connected to opacity. And we have to navigate interpretation within the classic, which is a matter of experience and culture all at once. And what is theologically at stake here is how the gift of uncanniness leads toward a comportment of recognition of being for the other in a radical apophatic posture, ready to receive the gift of the other, and trying to move away from projects of self-saturation and self-certainty. Moreover, the conversational and pluralistic frame that the classic for Tracy is encased in is helpful in understanding that tragical critical thought, as I am discussing, is in fact a contingent mode of thought, and that it is pulled along by deeper, more ethical theological thought, for example, like Cornel West's tragicomic thought. West writes, quote, "A tragicomic view is one that locates human beings as already in the mess of the world with no way to ever fully escape it. When we see our lives through this lens, the stress is partly on what the Enlightenment also affirmed, the courage to think critically about one's situation. Yet it is also on what the Enlightenment did not adequately articulate, the courage to care, to feel deep agony and anguish, to deal with the tears generated by the suffering that people experience. And this is not only a matter of following some objective and rational moral law, but is also rooted in the blood-drenched, tear-soaked traditions of resistance, critique, and contestation, and in the agency of the wretched of the earth." Can whiteness then ever give tragicomic thought? No. But within this conversational frame of whiteness reconfigured as a tragic symbol, white people can move toward an ethical future in understanding their racial selves as they look toward the depths of infinite mystery. And by keeping finitude and infinitude in conflict to the very end, an opacity-attuned ethics does not leave the body behind for the spirit or the container behind the name of the event, but embraces the universal as through the particular and finds public meaning through entering into the conflict of interpretations and the very fullness of language in all its particular and cultural manifestations. The white perspective is then recovered as one particular perspective instead of a universal and abstract claim to vision. It is recovered as the double journey of an intensified response to the experience of uncanniness, and then the intensification in expressing this within a genuinely public, that is pluralistic genre. In sum, whiteness must and re-symbolize its symbolism of perspective, color, and evil by thinking a tragic critical thought given out of the symbol of the classic, which can capture the tragic dimensions of symbolic opacity at stake through the emphasis on the classic's uncanniness and its overall conversational and pluralistic frame. This re-symbolization is ultimately kenotic for white people because this is the undoing of whiteness. Deconstructing whiteness comes to reveal, or rather preserves in the recognition of its own uncanniness, genuine zones of opacity, that is, alternative political and public universal spaces for the emergence and flourishing of darkness that is not a withdrawal from the mess of finitude, but an entering differently into the folds of the world. But there is a whole embodied aesthetic formation in need of radical change for white people, one that has positioned and habituated the white body to be at ease and secure a white world. Such work then would be difficult work and would involve radical bodily transformation of our senses, of white people's senses, that would come on the heels of the foundational critical therapeutic work I have discussed. The end vision, though, is to near a kind of perichoretic relation between non-ontological whiteness and non-ontological Blackness as a new public space of multiple perspectives is forged. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate your work and paper that you've shared with us today. And to all three of you, thank you so much again for just your evocative, imaginative, and embodied troubling of the status quo. An invitation to those of you who are gathered who were not our presenters, please send any questions or comments that you would like to engage our presenters with by sending me a note. And in that vein, I have a couple of them that I would like to raise to you. I think the first one that I have here is for you, Evan. Not that all three of you, I think, may have interest in also this same question. This is from Hector Garcia Chavez. Why does queer theory create such a panic in certain academic ivory towers, especially in theological circles? Could it be that heteroclassist patriarchy can no longer operate behind the curtain like the Wizard of Oz? Thank you for your question, Hector, and go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, to some extent, I would say, yes, you are correct that certain things aren't being allowed to operate behind the scenes anymore. I'm actually thinking about the conversation I had with Molly last night and our other colleague, LaShonda, who will be presenting later, where even beyond queer theory, critical race studies, feminist theory, like these theories point out ideologies and are critiquing ideologies, but in turn, they are condemned as presenting of another ideology when they're trying to critique ideologies. And that's the response that is thrown at them from those who are behind the curtain. You know, they've been revealed and they're saying, oh no, we're not really here, you're the ideology. Quick, try and pull the curtain back over ourselves before anything else escapes. So yeah, I do think there is a lot of truth to that. And I think for some people it can create a panic, but I mean, framing it even through the people I'm employing within the presentation I gave today, like you are showing that this impasse happens for everybody. By demanding a certain form of visibility and the articulation of queer existence, even if some people may see that as unintelligible, we do create another impasse by calling attention to the way that this ideology has functioned and still functions in our world. And perhaps people don't like that, and that causes a panic when we are put before an impasse where our world is threatened. People panic. Especially people who are not used to living in crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Molly or Nathan. Any additional comments or engagement that you would like to take with Hector's question? And I've just put that also into the general questions or general comment for everyone, so you can see the question. Yeah, Molly?
Yeah. Sure, yes. Thank you so much for your question, Hector. And yeah, it reminds me a lot of what we were talking about last night, of just this question of who gets to define what is an ideology, and some of the ways that bringing this into conversation, yeah, means it gets to challenge who's objective and who's coming from a perspective. One of my friends always likes to say, the personal is always political when the systems were not built for you. And I think this is maybe directly connecting to your question here, Hector, that perhaps, I'm not sure, maybe the ivory tower was built for hetero-classist patriarchy, and some of the questionings that queer theory brings up is a direct challenge to that structure. The question, of course, comes up is, what are we doing using queer theory within this ivory tower? Do we end up actually, and I think this is a great conversation too with Evan of, is there some sort of doubling down? Are we looking for reform? Are we looking for the ivory tower to be less hetero, less classist, less patriarchal? I would say yes, and yet at the same time, we have to ask how certain structures would function outside of those lenses. So thoughts to be considered for later.
Great. We got a thumbs up from Hector, so that's good. Thank you so much for engaging that. This next question, again, is from Hector. Much like Butler's Undoing Gender, which you make reference, I think to that in your work, Nathan, how else shall we not also undo US whiteness and US Christian performativity? So I'll take it first to you, Nathan, in view of your work, but I am quite sure, again, all three of you might have interest and or thoughts about that as well. And the question will again be in the chat for everyone here. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, is this a question that was maybe posed before, like in terms of the gender question before because I mean, I tried to explain that in fact, there is a connection, right, between thinking about the way that gender has been constructed and drawing connections to the way race has been constructed. So I honestly think, and there were a lot of resonances between our paper, that the attempting to undo the one is in fact an attempting to undo the other, which means we have to be aware of the intersectionality and how that stresses the thickness, in fact, of what we're doing. But I would argue, I mean, I gave my own understanding that in my perspective, you know, focusing on white people doing this critical kind of therapeutic work, which is both the work on themselves in terms of race, but also gender, and that hopefully that does in fact lead to new possibilities.
Thank you, Nathan. Molly or Evan, do you have anything that you'd like to engage with on that particular thread?
Whiteness being performative and not ontological, I feel like is something that I'm really thinking about. And I think, at least in my own work, I feel like there's a lot that I put on this historicizing of these categories and the way that they also are shifting, the way that whiteness is not a stable category, and that this is changing throughout different locations, throughout different geographies, cultural contexts, etc. So yeah, I mean, Hector, I think you answer your own question with another thumbs up there. But I think exactly drawing attention to the ways that whiteness is unstable as well. And that's confusing, much like the Judith Butler, that there's this sort of dominance that's actually very unstable that has to be continuously repeated. We can stop repeating it right now. But there comes along with all of these other kind of social structures that have been built through those repetitions. That would be my little addition.
Evan, you've unmuted yourself.
Short answer, yes, of course, we need to undo Christian performativity. I mean, that to me is the very act of dreaming of something different. Yes, you can potentially enact something new and something different that could hold its own performative force that could be proved to be problematic in the future. But I think that's why, for me, I want to pair the notion of this dreaming with the tools that we can take from Lauren Berlant, and what we can use and that critical interplay that can occur there. But yeah, fully, yes, we need to undo US Christian performativity.
Thank you. You know, just to all of you, thank you so much for your work and for your presentations. And you know, I'm reminded of the words of poet, spoken word artist, and activist Stacy Chin, when she says, everything is connected. And I think your work has evidenced that in seeking to trouble the question around the status quo. It's not just one question, it's all the questions, and that continued embodied exploration of all of us together doing this work of continually becoming human together. And I'm also just reminded, you know, 2 weeks ago in my city when Dante Wright was shot and killed, that Sunday was preaching on creation in view of Earth Day, etc. And went back to Genesis and Pope Francis 2013 homily at Lampedusa, when Pope Francis challenged the church to say, the response of Cain and Abel when Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer was, of course, yes. And just that connection, though, between our forgetting of creation, of one another, of ourselves, and how this is all connected. And so may we continue to trouble the status quo and those questions. Thank you so much to each of you for your work, and to those gathered for your participation and engagement. I'll invite the presenters to put in your email addresses. If you'd like to have further engagement with the presenters, please do that. With that, I will turn it over to our wonderful convener and bringer together of all of the things. That's an official title, Megan Toomey.